Good afternoon from the sunny and warm Copenhagen. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar Using Data to Measure Policy Impact, hosted by Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency in collaboration with World Resources Institute and various partners. This webinar is organized under the umbrella of the Building Efficiency Accelerator. My name is Aris and I work for the Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency. A couple of things before we jump into our very interesting webinar today. This webinar is going to be about 70 to 80 minutes long, and then we will have some time for the Q&A at the end. One of the questions we get, every single webinar, even when I make this announcement, is if this webinar is being recorded. And the answer is yes, we are recording it, and more information on how to access the recorded webinars will be presented in a few minutes. Finally, we're pleased to announce that more than 160 people have registered for this webinar. So, welcome to everybody. A few things about the Copenhagen Center. The Center conducts research and advisory activities in the field of energy efficiency and serves as energy efficiency hub for the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. The Center has an established network of global, regional, and national partners with a broad range of stakeholders to help accelerate the implementation of energy efficiency activities. We also support Buildings Efficiency Accelerator with hosting different webinars from various partners. I would like to briefly introduce the speaker of today's webinar. Eric is a World Resources Institute Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. He supports the Building Efficiency Initiative through program development, project management, and research. Carley and Alex are research analysts with the Global Climate Program through WRI, and Marco is an Energy Efficiency Matters with the Global Climate Program of WRI. On a regular basis, the Building Efficiency Accelerator is conducting webinars. All materials, including recordings and presentations from previous webinars, can be found on Copenhagen Center Knowledge Management System. In the e-learning section, we have a shortcut for the Building Efficiency Accelerator webinar collection. The material of today's webinar will be uploaded shortly. Finally, I would like to inform that you can send us your questions during the presentations, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can at the end. Please do not forget to mention the name of the panelist that the question is for. So, with that, I'm going to hand over to Eric. So, Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aris. Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Building Efficiency Accelerator, and then I'll pass it off to our speakers for the main event today. So the Building Efficiency Accelerator is affiliated with the Sustainable Energy for All, which is focused on achieving one goal of sustainable energy for all by 2030, defined by 3 different objectives. So this includes ensuring universal energy access, doubling the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency, and doubling the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. The accelerators are focused primarily on the energy efficiency goal, but also touch on these other elements. And so just to note that Sustainable Energy for All is the main initiative through which the United Nations coordinates and pursues achieving the objectives for Sustainable Development Goal number 7 of affordable and clean energy. But these activities also touch on many other sustainable development goals, everything from climate action to good health and well-being. Energy efficiency is touching elements across the economy, and so is sustainable energy more broadly. The Building Efficiency Accelerator is one of several energy efficiency accelerators that are part of the Global Energy Efficiency Accelerator platform, which is convened by the Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency, Aris's organization, and that we have sister accelerators focusing on lighting, appliances and equipment, district energy, industry, vehicle fuel economy. The Building Efficiency Accelerator is also affiliated with the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. And this is an initiative that brings more visibility through communication of the importance of building efficiency, collaboration among building efficiency focused and related organizations, and visibility about the solutions to improve building efficiency in addressing climate and addressing other global challenges. So the Building Efficiency Accelerator is an implementing partner, and we work in cities around the world to make the possibilities of building efficiency reality. So why building efficiency? Why do we focus on this? Because there's huge opportunity, and there are benefits across the economic, social, and environmental elements. There's a huge opportunity to reduce the consumption of building efficiency of energy in buildings through reducing demand, and which will also significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And our focus is on buildings also because they're such long-lasting assets. They can last 40 or more years, and the choices we're making today either put us on a path to a strong, clean, resilient economy, or one where we're locking in high emissions and poor services. So that choice is very important, and we're working with these partners. These are global NGOs, multilateral associations, and importantly, energy efficiency businesses that are working together to support action in BEA city partner jurisdictions. We have at this point 35 business organizational partners and 28 city partners around the world, where we support planning, policy design, and project design. So what do the cities sign up to do? They're committing to this overall commitment related to sustainable energy for all, of doubling the rate of building energy efficiency in their jurisdiction by 2030. And they commit to doing that, to moving toward that vision through implementing one enabling policy, one or more demonstration project, and reporting, having a method of tracking progress and sharing their experiences. And the BEA helps them to achieve those goals that they set through at least 4 different sets of solutions. So we provide this local action prioritization process, methods that have been used in other cities that have led to kind of catalytic action, working through a collaborative multi-stakeholder process to assess where are the opportunities to move forward, where's their consensus, and how do you build from small successes to be able to do more. Our network also provides, our network of solution providers also has tools, expertise, and solutions, everything from analytical tools to additional process elements, one of which we're going to be talking about today as we learn about using data to measure impact of building efficiency action. The BEA also works with partner cities to connect them to financial partners, multilateral development banks, private banks, national development banks, et cetera, to find the finance that's needed to implement the priority projects that are identified through the BEA process in these cities. And then finally, the BEA, through our partners, Sustainable Energy for All, the Global Alliance for Building and Construction, and other, provide opportunity for recognition of city action, and importantly also transparency and accountability of how cities are doing toward their goals, celebrating when they're on the right track, and encouraging through a network of peers to be doing more and to be learning about best practice solutions. So with that, I will wrap up. I just want to say that we welcome new business, nonprofit, and government partners to join the BEA. If you have more questions about what that would look like and any other questions about the BEA, you can feel free to be in contact with me or my colleague, Debbie Weil, and there's a lot more information on the buildingefficiencyaccelerator.org website. And with that, let me pass it over to Carley, who will begin the core content for today. Focused on using data to measure building efficiency policy impacts.
Great, thank you so much, Eric. So thank you all for joining us, and let's get started. So here is an agenda of what you can expect for us to cover in today's webinar, and I'd like to get started with a bit of background. So as I said, this webinar is part of the Tools for Sustainability webinar series, which goes over the process of conducting an impact assessment for BEA policies and projects. Today's webinar is third in our series, and we are going to go over conducting calculations for the impact assessment. So I'll go through this a bit quickly. I'm sure some of you have joined us in our previous webinars, and feel free to reference the first one for more background information. But today in this webinar series, we're focusing on the second type of tracking progress. We'll be looking at tracking the actual progress in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions and energy savings for your BEA policies and projects. And why we're tracking these is to help cities understand the effects of your policies and projects, specifically understanding the amount of greenhouse gas reductions so that you can communicate progress towards goals, or to attract investors in an accountable and transparent way, and to help focus on where to potentially scale up projects with particular promise based on the analysis. And again, it's important to remember that greenhouse gas impacts are just one way of looking at the many benefits of energy efficiency. Of course, there are other types of impacts that you can focus on as part of your analysis, where greenhouse gas emissions reductions and energy savings are just two of the ways of looking at it. This could also include health and well-being, employment, and poverty alleviation, for example. And so the process so far, we've been working on impact estimation for our 7 deep dive cities, and we'll hear from Mexico City, one of them today, in just a few minutes. Unfortunately, we can't work with all cities on a one-on-one basis, but we have materials that were produced in the process of conducting these deep dive assessments and can be shared, and we'll provide these resources. And you can see the process here that we're doing with our impact analysis with cities, and right here you can see how our webinars match up. And again, today we're in that third stage of the assessment, and we'll have more materials going forward. And again, the process that we'll be using today is part of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which sets the global standard for measuring and managing greenhouse gas emissions. The protocol is part of a multi-stakeholder partnership that sets the accounting and reporting standards. There's also sector-based guidance on emissions available for the building sector, and other online training and webinars such as this one available free of charge on the website. And so today, specifically, we'll be focusing on the policy action standard, as that's what we're using to conduct the assessments. It's a standard in line with the International Organizations for Standards development process, and as such, it's policy neutral. It doesn't provide guidance on which type of policy or project for cities to implement, nor does it prescribe any particular methodology, but rather it details a general process to follow when conducting assessment. And as such, it looks at the given impacts of a policy and a project, whether the policy or project is on track to deliver expected results, and what effect the policy or project has had or can have on greenhouse gas emissions. And here's an overview of the standard, really taken from the table of contents. You can see this is what part of the assessment we're focusing on today. Just to recap from our last session, where we went over defining the policy in action, where we defined the details of the policy and project to be assessed, and then identified all potential effects of the policy or project, included them in a causal chain, and then defined the greenhouse gas assessment boundary around significant effects. And with those effects that we identified, now we're moving into collecting data and conducting the calculations for these impacts. So with that recap, let's go ahead and move on to data sourcing. So now with our given impacts, we look toward what data is necessary for the assessment. Well, if you look at the equation here, we're measuring greenhouse gas emissions. It is a factor of activity data and the relevant emissions factor. With activity data is a quantified measure of a level of activity that results in greenhouse gas emissions taking place during a given period of time. And where an emissions factor is a measure of the mass of greenhouse gas emissions relative to a unit of activity. So here's a table of some examples. Let's take the example of efficient lighting equipment, for instance, as that's a measure that's come up quite a bit in retrofits and building codes. So if you look at the left-hand column of the activity data examples, for example, with efficient lighting, in the second box there, you have kilowatt hours of electricity consumed, for instance. And moving to the right-hand side, we have the mass of carbon dioxide emitted per kilowatt hour of electricity consumed. These are two examples, and you have the table here. Sourcing activity data can require gathering existing data, generating new data, and adapting data if necessary. It's a good practice to start data collection activities with an initial screening of available data sources, keeping in mind that data should be from reliable and robust sources, and that data should be time and geographically specific to the assessment boundary. And when you're sourcing data, some places to begin your search could be with government departments and statistics agencies, universities and research institutes, scientific and technical articles, environmental books, journals, reports, and even sector experts and stakeholders that you work with. So now let's step back and look at the data collection process. So starting on the left box, with data collection, effort should be prioritized based on the greenhouse gas effects expected to have the most significant impact on total results. In general, users should collect higher quality data for those effects determined to be the most significant when defining the greenhouse gas assessment boundary that we covered in our previous webinar. Secondly, after prioritizing the greenhouse gas effects, users should select data based on the objectives of the assessment and the level of accuracy needed to meet those objectives. Also, according to data availability and the quality of data available. So when we say quality data, what are we talking about? Well, accuracy is definitely an aspect of that. And in choosing a level of accuracy, you should consider the desired level of accuracy and completeness based on the objectives of the assessment and its intended uses of the results, and the level of accuracy and completeness required to meet these objectives. And more considerations can be the relative significance of the policy or project being assessed. Sometimes it comes down to data availability and also capacity, resources, and the time available to carry out your assessment. So here is a table. We have examples of methodologies, and also for our focus on the right, the furthest right-hand side has a measure of sources of data and their accuracy. So starting from the top of that column there of source of data for drivers and parameters. In general, emissions of each greenhouse gas are calculated by multiplying the activity data, such as we reviewed, with the emission factor. And the tier used to estimate emissions will depend on the quality and quantity of data that are available. And when we say tier, we're referring to an IPCC terminology used to categorize the accuracy and specificity of the methodologies. So the Tier 1 sections, starting with the first box of international default values, these set out the steps needed for the simplest calculation methods, or methods that require the least data. So these are likely to provide the least accurate estimates of emissions, but they're also the most widely available. So as we move down in increasing accuracy, we have the Tier 2 and Tier 3 approaches that require more detailed data and resources, therefore requiring some more time, expertise, and country-specific data to produce an estimate of emissions. And properly applied, the higher tiers should be more accurate. So with that, moving on to the data collection phase, data collection should be viewed in the context of the overall policy or project assessment process. The precise data that we'll need to collect depends on the policy in question, the stage in the assessment process, such as defining the baseline or estimating the greenhouse gas effects ex ante for BEA cities, and also the method being followed. So here's an outline of the data collection process that begins with describing the details of how the data were compiled. Next, any changes to the data, such as cleaning data sets or removing outliers, should be documented along with a brief justification for each change. And lastly, data sets should be judged on their overall quality, and quality assurance or quality control procedures should be followed. Finally, next we have the filling the gaps step. So in the case that data of sufficient quality are not available, proxy data can be used to fill the gaps. When we say proxy data, we're talking about data from a similar activity that is used as a stand-in for a given activity, such as similar data from geographic regions. Proxy data used in the assessment should be strongly correlated with the relevant parameter that we're looking for. So here's a little bit about different bottom-up and top-down methods, which can be used at any phase of the data collection processes, but also for the filling the gaps instance, where both bottom-up and top-down data methods are valuable for different purposes. For instance, bottom-up data are those that are measured or collected, such as conducting an energy audit of a building, whereas top-down data can include macro statistics collected at the jurisdiction level or even national level and scaled to appropriate city size. Hybrid approaches that combine elements of both bottom-up and top-down approaches can also be used. And finally, it's important to highlight that collecting data, assessing data quality, and improving data quality is an iterative process. Over time, users should replace lower quality data with higher quality data as it becomes available. So with that, let's turn it over to Marco, who will give us the experience from Mexico City.
Thank you very much, Carly. Hello, everyone. So thank you for the invitation to be part of this and to show what we are working with Mexico City. I'm the energy efficiency manager for WRI Mexico, and I'm in charge of taking the activities within the BEA with Mexico City. So I would like to make a quick review of what Eric just explained at the beginning. Mexico City is part of the BEA, and it has committed to have a policy and a project within the BEA activities. And the policy is regarding about to adopt and implement energy building codes and oriented to energy efficiency. And the project is to retrofit 4 or more public buildings by utilizing energy audits and creating a benchmark tools. So I would like to update what are we working on, but first let me just explain how we get to this step. So by September on 2014, Mexico City government commitment to implement this energy, to have a building energy code and to retrofit public buildings. So we created a workshop on March on 2015 to have a common vision, and we have invited multi-stakeholders participants and to explain what is the BEA, what is the actions, what will be required, and to identify the barriers and the process and what is the needs and how can we make this to go forward. So we developed an action plan with 4 work groups chaired by Mexico City government staff, each one of these, and a local partner, and everything managed by WRI Mexico. So we have some of the works in the next months, and with that working group have made some of decisions on how we're gonna work it on this. So what was the process? By March to August on 2015, we launched this technical workshop which I just mentioned about it. And by October in 2015, we have the recommendations from the group that were delivered to the city. And so by June in 2016, the construction regulations were adopted, making reference to technical norms with energy code for first time, as the reglamento of the construction, which is the construction regulations for Mexico, hasn't been updated in many years, like 8 to 10 years, I think so, and it never includes these words of energy efficiency. So with the update, these technical norms were included and regarding to energy efficiency in buildings and appliances. So by September 2016, Mexico City have a bid requested for energy audits on 4 public buildings, which were concluded by January on 2017, and these audits have recommendations on how to make the retrofit of these buildings. And by April of 2017, these funds were committed to make these actual retrofits of these 4 buildings. And now that the current state, by the end of this year, we are planning to have 15 more additional buildings to be audited. The target is to have a 13% of the city's municipal buildings to be audited. So what are we doing today? We have this citywide energy saving challenge for large buildings, which we are planning to include a private sector. We're planning to have training programs for implementation of building energy codes, as many of these norms included on this side of the regulations are not well understood, and many people from the construction sector doesn't even know that these norms exist, and they know how they exist, they don't know how to comply with them. So it is an issue to have this training so we can guarantee that these norms are compliant. And well, we are refining a funding model for public building retrofits, as Mexico City have a suggestion of how to make these retrofits, but we have to figure out a better one that could be replicated more times. And to assessment the impacts of these projects and these policies, that's why we are working with the greenhouse gas protocol with Carley and Alex, which kindly help us to develop a tracking progress. As Eric mentioned and Carley mentioned, it is pretty important to have this assessment of these actions. And well, for the policy, we define to make the to analyze the GHG and local pollutants and energy savings will be the impact that we will be measuring or calculating. And for project was the same, but also including the cost savings of this energy not uses. For fuel assessed, we have electricity and natural gas in the policy, and for the project only electricity, because for the project we are only including some recommendations will be taken on lighting and some computer equipment and sensors from of different kinds. So all of these actions will be focused to save electricity. But for the policy, we'll be including also some of the things for solar water heaters. That's why we're including natural gas. And in the type of actions, the policy applies only for new buildings, and in the projects, of course, works for existing buildings. So that's where we'll be trying to assess what is the impact of this. I will just go to next slide, because I don't want to take much of my time on this. To define the assessment boundary, which Carley just explained how to determine this. On the policy effects, the measures included are solar water heating, efficient heater cooling improvement, that is regarding to air conditioners mainly, and efficient lighting and electric water pumps. And in the project side, we'll be having efficient appliances and different sensors. So the idea is to reduce the GHG emissions and to measure these reductions. So on the current phase, we are on the data collation and methodology selection. And as Carley pointed out, it is pretty important to have this data, and that's one of the main barriers or challenges that Mexico City has, as there's really an important lack of reliable information about about the greenhouse protocol requires. So the lack of this data is an important thing, and we're trying to figure out how to get it, as many of this information works on a national level, but we don't have information on city level. So we can make some projections about it and some calculations, but there's a layer of data which will be reliable. And so it is important to have this information, because with this we can show to the city and to other cities why it's important to have a program in retrofitting, and why it's important to have energy codes for buildings. And this could be helpful to decisions takers from Mexico City to decide how to create the public policy on this matter. To have the local data will gives certainty on different projects, and it will help to identify the potentials of GHG mitigations due to energy efficiency in buildings. So we are working to get in this required data, and And we're hoping to have it pretty soon, so we can make these calculations and give to Mexico City to have this data. Also will help to develop a baseline which is not currently existing in Mexico, so it will be of really help to the city. Well, that was what I want to comment. So I'll pass the control to Alex, so she could continue with this presentation.
Great, thank you, Marco. So kind of going to the next logical conclusion here, or the next step, as Marco mentioned, they're in the process of collecting some of that data that will go into figuring out, determining a baseline, and so they can assess the GHG impacts of that policy, or the series of bundles of policies that they're looking at with Mexico City. And once they've really determined the methodology for estimating those emissions and inputting them into a baseline, I guess we're going to walk through a step or an example here of using a home insulation subsidy as kind of the example that we walk through to match up with the previous examples we've done for the last couple webinars, just kind of keeping that example kind of consistent along the way as we go, but showing exactly the process that is described and the guidance that is provided in the policy and action standard from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And so just a note on attribution here for the GHG effects. I think this is an important contextual conversation to have around doing an assessment of policy impacts, is that this standard focuses on the attribution of reductions to specific policies and actions. And for some purposes, this may not be necessary for folks who just want to track trends in key indicators, but the guidance that we provide with the GHG protocol there's some guidance on tracking indicators in Chapter 10 of the standard, but attributing reductions to specific policies and actions is really the focus of what we're looking at, because it reveals how effective these individual policies are, which we think is much more applicable and useful to a wide range of objectives for implementing and deciding between policies. And so the kind of large view here is that we're looking at the net change in GHG emissions between the policy and the baseline scenario. And so on a very basic level, we have to, for each year in the boundary of assessment, to model or calculate the net scenario, the net GHG emissions from the policy scenario that we build and the baseline scenario that we build. And so the distinction there is that the baseline scenario is a reference case that represents the events and conditions most likely to occur in the absence of the policy or action being assessed. And so in this example, we would have, if we're going to look at the home subsidy or home insulation subsidy, it would be the baseline scenario is the energy used in homes in the absence of a insulation subsidy, which is put into effect to help support the home insulation and reduce energy costs over the long term. The policy scenario is the scenario that represents the events and conditions most likely to occur in the presence of that policy. So we are looking at the difference between the GHG effects of these two scenarios to figure out the effects that we'd be looking for. Some users may want to look at just one or the other or both. I think that, in terms of doing an assessment on the GHG impacts, you look at the difference between the two to assess and estimate the net GHG effects of the specific policy or action. So if we look first at estimating baseline emissions, just a quick overview of the steps as they're presented in the GHG protocol guidance is that defining the most likely baseline scenario. So that's looking at all of the drivers, the GHG potential GHG effects and helping to assess kind of in that boundary assessment, linking back to the causal chain that we looked at before, determining which of those sources are included in this kind of baseline scenario that would be calculated out, and selecting the desired level of accuracy, which Carley had mentioned a bit earlier in the slides. Defining the emissions estimation methods and parameters needed to calculate baseline emissions, and so this relates back again to the level of accuracy desired and what kind of data is required to calculate and execute those estimations, and how they relate to the data that is available. Then executing the calculation itself and estimating the baseline values for each parameter, which allows you to estimate the emissions from each category that you're looking at. And just for some of the items that are included in the guidance, for an ex post assessment, which is looking at the historical data or looking backwards at a policy, you have the scenario method, which is a comparison of the baseline scenario with the policy scenario for versus the comparison group method, which is applicable for some cases in an ex post assessment. And this is more like looking at a control group. If you have, for instance, if we're using this example of a home insulation subsidy, looking at the energy performance related to those sources and emission sources connected to a specific region. If you have maybe one neighborhood where the subsidy was enacted and another neighborhood with similar kind of conditions, there's this other method, this comparison group method, that is also included briefly and covered in the guidance as well. And just the decision tree for considering if those if this is a possible choice for developing a scenario based on this kind of control group method, is figuring out if it is an ex ante assessment or an ex post. And if it is ex post and the comparison group method is feasible and appropriate, and perhaps that's somewhat of a subjective definition there, then it would be possible to use. And there's more details about how to do that and how to do that in the GHG protocol policy and action standard and guidance. But I think we won't quite go into all those in this quick example. So when defining the most likely baseline scenario, the most likely scenario depends on the drivers that would affect the emissions in the absence of the policy or action being assessed. And so the two primary types of drivers that we see that get kind of included into these policy and baseline, or into the baseline scenarios rather, is that the other overlapping, reinforcing policies and actions that do influence the emission sources that we're looking at, and also some non-policy drivers such as the socioeconomic factors, market forces. It could be a number of different factors that get included into a policy baseline. So if we're looking into this example from this home insulation subsidy, then after we have done the mapping of the causal chain and we've had a lot of the boundary considerations, and we're getting towards the step where the data has been collected and the calculation methods that we'd want to use have been determined already, and then we're going in to perform the calculations and include them in this kind of, we're setting up the baseline scenario essentially. In this example, the GHG effects that were deemed significant include the reduced emissions from electricity use after the subsidy has been enacted, the reduced emissions from home natural gas use, that's space heating, which is, again, from the effects after the subsidy has been enacted and homes have taken up new insulation and adopted those new projects and retrofits, and then the increased emissions from insulation production. So the effect on the market of the new demand for insulation for those homes. And just to do an example on the natural gas combustion, what kind of the process we would use to develop the baseline for that in a case where we have no home insulation subsidy versus one where we do have the home insulation subsidy. So the first step is define the equation and all parameters to calculate baseline emissions. So for this we have, we want to look at 2020 as the example because we're doing a forward-looking kind of projection with this. The baseline natural gas use, and here the units, million British thermal units, and baseline emission factor. So that would be the CO2 equivalent per million British thermal units for natural gas, which can be retrieved or kind of translated from the IPCC default emission factors. So step 2, once we have that equation, we look at how we determine the baseline values for each of the parameters and identifying the policy and non-policy drivers and assumptions. So here, if you look at the kind of the methodology and assumptions to estimate values here for this natural gas use, the methodology starts with an assessment of the historical data, and so they look for this jurisdiction that's being considered the average annual natural gas use for space heating over the previous 10 years is about 1.25 million British thermal units a year. And that trend over the past years has been pretty constant, and after you kind of normalize for variations in the heating and cooling degree days, it seems rather constant rather than including those kind of elements of variation. And so that's giving us a fairly good idea that that there's some level of constancy with the amount of natural gas use within that community, that jurisdiction. Looking at some of the implemented and adopted policies, which would be also included in the baseline scenario, because this is forward-looking, this is looking several years ahead and would include the change in natural gas use that reflect the federal or other levels of government, the policies and efficiency standards that are expected to be included. And so in here, in this example, there is a federal energy efficiency standard which expects to reduce natural gas use by 10% in the baseline scenario. There's a federal energy tax that's expected to reduce natural gas use by 7.5%, taking into account overlaps with the federal energy efficiency standard, which just mentioned. And then in this case, we also have non-policy drivers, which are included in the baseline scenario. And so that would be, for instance, here, natural gas prices projected to increase 20% and reduce natural gas use by about 2% in the baseline in accordance with this kind of 20% increase. And that might be based on, a review of peer-reviewed literature or some other kind of energy consumption demand kind of social behavior research that would be available to check against. And then the last point that was included in this kind of methodology that we used for this was the free rider effect of 10% of the households that receive the subsidy expected to install insulation even if they do not receive the subsidy. And so that's also coming from some peer-reviewed literature somewhere, and that would be cited and referenced as well as we go forward. And so with that, we're looking at a baseline emissions level for the year 2020, I believe, that is considering all those kind of effects and trends over time with using kind of that historical data of 1.25 million British thermal units. And for the simplicity of this example, the result of that is a million British thermal units from 2010 to 2025. And so we translate that the natural gas use in that baseline scenario where we've looked at all of the factors, the drivers, and divvy those out, multiply the gas use by the emission factor from combustion of the natural gas in home heating, and we get 55 million kilograms of CO2 equivalent, 55,000 tons. And so that would be included in this kind of tally for this year of what the baseline emissions would be for 2020. And then if we repeat kind of that process or that exercise also for the reduced emissions from electricity use, and then for the increased emissions from insulation production, of course using kind of a different set of assumptions, but going through that same process, then we get the baseline emissions for, total baseline emissions for that year to be 110,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. So estimating the GHG effects ex ante, and just to kind of go back to what an ex ante and ex post assessment are, we're looking at the difference from a kind of a forward-looking projection, or in an ex ante kind of development of a baseline scenario, and looking at an ex ante policy scenario versus a ex post assessment, which you're looking at the ex post baseline. You're looking at the kind of what the baseline would have been from the point of the start of that policy versus the observed emissions that are included in that actual historical policy scenario. Estimating the GHG effects from the policy and action, policy or action in this case, is again, it's the total policy scenario emissions minus the total baseline scenario emissions, and that is just the difference there is as you're looking at an ex ante kind of approach versus an ex post historical emission approach. And so we have an example here of a Tunisia solar energy program that used this kind of approach to look at the GHG emissions from in an ex ante perspective for a solar photovoltaic program that they had to support the, I guess, residents and commercial buildings to install solar PV systems. And it was, I think, rolled out through the National Agency for Energy Conservation, which also used this policy and action standard to evaluate the program's effect to date, and then to also estimate the effect of the expected future effect through 2030. And so in this case, it was an ex post assessment to a certain date, and then also an ex ante assessment looking forward to 2030. And then their assessment found, you have the baseline emissions in red, and the policy scenario emissions is the result of their kind of emissions and calculations looking forward, and you have in that effect cumulatively about 4 million tons of CO2 equivalent from that 2014 to 2030 period as a result of the calculations. So a note here on estimating the policy values, policy scenario values for specific parameters. And this is, I think, in relation to selecting which of the drivers and which of the kind of emission policy and baseline drivers go into which scenario. The GHG sources and sinks not affected by the policy or action are used for baseline values, and the GHG sources and sinks that are affected by the policy or action estimated in the policy scenario values. I think that's fairly straightforward, but this step does take, I think, some consideration and some thought into determining what the difference is between the baseline scenario assumptions versus the policy scenario assumptions, and just keeping those two kind of streams of thought separated can be pretty helpful for separating out exactly what should be included. So if we look back towards the example of the home insulation subsidy that we had, the previous example was about calculating the baseline emission scenario. This one is for estimating the policy scenario emissions. So the changes that we're looking at is the policy scenario natural gas use versus the natural gas use in the baseline scenario. So if we look at only the parameters affected by the policy scenario in this case, we have the values or the methodology used to estimate the policy scenario in this case would be that about a 30% uptake in the insulation subsidy starting in 2015. So there are assumptions built into this policy scenario about what the progress of implementation would be and the level of adoption over time for the subsidy, and then what that adoption leads to in terms of energy reductions per home. And so they have that cited as peer-reviewed literature. And then the natural gas emissions factor would be the same as kind of previously stated. So going forward, that is just executing the calculation as before. So you have the baseline emissions, the same level included from 2010 to 14, and then this policy assumption brought into the mix from 2014 or 2015, sorry, going forward, and the calculation for that is as follows. And then bringing those all kind of into the fold together, the baseline emissions scenarios, baseline emissions versus the policy scenario emissions for each of those emission sources that we were looking at. And so for each of those years, the net change in emissions calculated below as 11,000 tons. I think the last note here on some of the estimation methods, the deemed estimates method is also something that has been used, and that there is a little bit of guidance in the policy and action standard. This is essentially taking the number of actions, estimating the changes in GHG emissions per action taken, and multiplying that by the GHG effect of each of those, and then aggregating that across each of the items that are being looked at. And so this is an example. I think the simplest one would be if you're replacing a light bulb and you have an estimate for the net change in emissions from a single light bulb replacement, and multiplying that effect over by the number of light bulbs. That's an example of this, but I think it can come under some scrutiny for maybe it misses a lot of the unintended impacts of some of the changeovers and some of the GHGs that would be impacted, and I think it's a bit of a simpler approach that doesn't capture kind of the wider array of things, and so that is the conclusion of that estimation section. I think we're moving on to the Q&A section. So I'll pass it back to Aris.
Thank you, Alex. Okay. Now it's the time for the Q&A session. Please send us your question, and we'll do our best to answer them as possible. The first question is for Carley, and the question is, in case of not being able to access to quality of data, how important should be the accuracy?
Thank you for the question. This is a tough dilemma that many cities face as far as access for quality. In order to conduct the assessment, completeness of data is most important. I'd say even if it requires scaling or some of the other methods we talked about, but always trying to improve quality, and like we talked about in the last step, improving quality over time as better quality data become available. Sorry if that doesn't fully address your question. I'd invite any of the other panelists to share their thoughts on this.
Okay, let's continue to the next one. The next one is for Alex, and it seems pretty simple. Why you used only 2 scenarios for your presentation?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I think for the purpose of simplicity, I think we're just trying to be illustrative about the way that the emissions reductions are associated with a policy are calculated. In having a couple different policy scenarios in terms of that I think that would be a common practice, and that's something that you would tend to do. But for illustrative purposes, we just use one simple assumption, and that's something that is also, I think, fair to do in terms of the estimates that people do report out, and having the single kind of policy scenario that represents the most likely case. Again, it is common to have what you might call an optimistic scenario or a bit of a conservative scenario in terms of what the GHG impacts would be, and then have what you consider, based on the literature, based on expert judgment, to be the most likely case as the kind of central one that you do pursue. It's a good question. I think the answer that I'm providing may be a little bit ambiguous as well, saying that it is fairly common to have, kind of the range represented, but to with the final numbers that are being presented, stick with what appears to be the most likely case.
Question is for Carley, and the question is, which are the 7 cities that you're doing the impact analysis?
Hi, great. Thanks for your question. We're working with Belgrade, Bogota, Da Nang, Eskişehir, Mexico City, Rajkot, and Schwane.
Thank you, Carley. The next question is for Alex, and it's like the question says, based on which assumptions you decided to use those 2 scenarios?
Let me know if I'm interpreting this wrong, but we have the 2 scenarios that we were looking at was the baseline scenario that was an assumption of the absence of the policy that we're looking at, and in this case it was the home insulation subsidy. And then the other scenario was the policy scenario, where we assumed that the home insulation subsidy was included. And so because this was an ex ante assessment, it was kind of forward-looking. Embedded in the baseline scenario, kind of looking forward to that year 2020, the assessment is using a series of assumptions that take into account the federal policy, or the federal or state policy that is affecting that may be affecting the use of natural gas in homes and home heating. And there was an energy efficiency policy that was mentioned, and also I believe a tax as well that was included. And then the assumptions that are included in that are I think in this case only an example that might not be sourced legitimately from literature, but the process you would take to go through that is to look at the academic literature, to consult the information that is kind of provided and contained within academic literature and other sources, and to basically clearly source what the assumptions are in the drivers that are used to calculate the forward-looking baseline and policy emissions. And so those two scenarios that were presented, the baseline and the policy, the difference between those two is the calculated effect of the policy or action being considered by the way that we define it in the standard. And there should be some good materials in the standard itself if there's questions further about some specifics about that, and then justification for that. I suggest consulting some of those for kind of a more in-depth and comprehensive answer.
Thank you, Alex. The next question is, What's the level of collaboration and engagement with these selected 7 cities in terms of communicating intended results and preliminary results of the study? I think it's for Carley, that question.
Hi, yes, thanks. So I'd say it's a high level of cooperation and engagement. We kicked off with the impact assessments with the face-to-face meetings at the Sustainable Energy for All Forum in New York, and have been keeping engagement by phone or email since that point.
Thank you, Carley. The next question is for Alex, and it says, what kind of tools are being used to gather the data?
So I'll let Carley take part of this if the question pertains to, I think, those 7 cities and the process they're doing there. But I'll speak generally about it. Just first, I think there are a number of there's actually a tool, a policy and action tool that folks use. It's an Excel-based tool that folks use to go through the process of mapping out the boundary, the assessment boundary of the baseline and policies that are being looked at, to do that kind of the causal chain exercise as well that involves some of the mapping out, and then to define what some of the parameters are. But a lot of the data that is sourced outside of that is through working with the city governments or folks who are data providers like utilities and others. And then for data that goes into the assumptions around what the policy effects and some of the drivers are, that's a lot of consulting statistical agencies looking at academic literature that's relevant in the GHG accounting and that realm, and also working with cities and other data providers there. So Carley, maybe to jump in with some of the data collection that's happening with those 7 cities.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so I would agree with all of that. In the case with Mexico City, for example, started with a preliminary survey of available data and looked at intergovernmental organizations and available data sets, and bringing that body of knowledge and marrying it with the information that our city technical partners had, and the city-specific information available. So yeah, but mostly just a broad review.
Thank you. Now we have a follow-up question. I think it's for Carley. In case if other city that is not part of this study want to access tools and possibly want to be part of the Building Efficiency Accelerator, what should be the steps for such knowledge and capacity building potentials?
Great, thanks. So there's quite a bit that a city can do. I would definitely refer you to one of my colleagues, unfortunately, that couldn't join today, Debbie Weil or Eric Mackres, whose emails were included in the presentation. But I can tell you that definitely resources for tracking progress are available to all BEA cities, and which includes some of what we do here with the impact assessment. Again, just all of the information on the greenhouse gas protocol and the policy and action standard can also be found online. So there's those are 2 sources I'd like to highlight specifically: the BEA website and the greenhouse gas protocol website. And again, I refer you any city or organizations can join as a partner. So I would encourage that if you're interested.
The next question is for Marco, and the question is, what was the biggest challenge when gathering the data for the retrofits?
Well, thank you very much for the question. There was not the most difficult part is that many of the buildings for the public sector didn't have updated that inventory of equipment. So people that make the energy audits has to be counting one by one and taking notes of the specifications of those equipment, like from every computer and for every lighting system. So I think that was the most difficult part, because buildings are from the public sector, so they were willing to share the information they have. And other thing is that many of these buildings have several changes on the boundaries of the building, I mean inside the building, like they create new offices and they remove some offices, they make some space for a meeting room, then they change that meeting room and divide it. So that kind of changes are not registered anywhere there, nor in the plan. So that was the most complicated part, maybe, but it wasn't really a big challenge.
Thank you very much, Marco. Also, we have another question for you, and the question is: you defined your assessment boundary, but I would like to know more about how you will obtain that data. Are you using building management systems that have remote sensors relay data to a central control system?
Yes, thank you. So I have to explain it more about this. The boundaries were selected considering the norms that we're applying, and for the retrofits, the actions that we will be taking, the measures that we'll be doing. So no, there will be no measure for having this data, as many of this data could be obtained by the historical consumption of electricity, and the idea is to get some of this past information and make a projection on how this will be changing in the future. For example, on the price of the electricity, it is not they haven't made any analysis on how this price of electricity will be changing in the future. So we have to estimate it somehow. But no, we are not thinking of having this measuring for gathering this data. But we are planning to do it to prove the energy savings of these measures and the feasibility of doing it. It will be of really importance to have this data for creating a benchmark, but not for the assessment that we are talking about.
Thank you very much, Marco. It seems that we approached the end of our webinar. Thank you for the detailed responses to the questions. I would like to say thanks to Eric, Carley, Marco, and Alex for the informative and interesting presentations, and to the audience for their active participation. The presentation will be beneficial for all stakeholders involved in green building. Thank you for your attention and wish you a good day or night from Copenhagen.